Greetings! Over the course of several centuries, the Franks went from being a small, barbarian tribal confederation to an empire that encompassed a significant part of Western Europe. This empire was built by the power of arms, and therefore, naturally, the story of the Frankish army explains much about the history of early medieval Europe. It was precisely as a result of the evolution of the Frankish state's army in the 8th century that the so-called feudalism emerged, with its fiefs and estates, lords and vassals, something we once read about in our school textbooks. Yes, indeed, my esteemed viewer. I intend, among other things, to prove that the feudal system which was established in Europe for several centuries was not so much a result of economic factors, but to a much greater extent of military history. Two dynasties ruled in the Frankish state. The Merovingians, named after the legendary Frankish king Merovingius, and the Carolingians, who received their name from their most outstanding representative, Charlemagne. In the history of the development of the Frankish army, two stages can also be distinguished. In the first stage, the army was a militia of free Franks. As is known, the entire territory of the Frankish state was divided into districts called counties, headed by royal ministerials, counts. The count gathered the militia of his district and commanded it. The counties were divided into hundreds, and accordingly the militia of the county was divided into hundreds. Thus the word hundred referred both to a territorial unit and to a military subdivision. Therefore, it should be understood that 100 was essentially a group of relatives and neighbors fighting together, shoulder to shoulder. Relations within the Frankish army were quite patriarchal, and kings were forced to take the wishes of the warriors into account. Such relations are evidenced by the famous episode with the Soissons vase, described by Gregory of Tours. After the sack of the Cathedral of Reims, the Bishop of Reims asked for the return of a goblet of remarkable beauty to the cathedral. Clovis immediately agreed, but the problem was that everything taken in plunder was subject to division among all the warriors. The king tried to exclude the goblet from this division, asking the army to give it to him in addition to his share. But one of the warriors struck the goblet with his sword, saying, "You will receive from here only what is rightfully yours by lot." All Clovis could do was hand over the fragments of the sacred vessel to the bishop's messenger. But soon, during the annual People's Assembly, accompanied by a military review known as the March Field, Clovis, accusing the aforementioned warrior of keeping his weapons in poor condition, split his head open with an axe. At that moment, Clovis said, "That is how you acted with that goblet at Soissons." The overwhelming majority of the Frankish army consisted of infantry, although there was still a small number of horsemen who fought together with their 100. The national weapon of the Franks was the Francisca, an axe with 1 or 2 blades. A rope was attached to the axe, and the Frank skillfully threw it at the enemy at close range. For hand-to-hand combat, the Franks, like other barbarian tribes, used swords. In addition to the Francisca and the sword, the Franks were armed with a short spear, the angon, with barbs on a long, sharp head. The barbs of the angon were backward-facing, making it very difficult to pull out of a wound. First, the warrior would throw the angon, which would stick into the enemy's shield, and then he would step on the shaft of the angon, pull the shield down, and strike the opponent with his sword. The angon could not be pulled out because its barbs had pierced the shield. It also could not be chopped off with a sword because the shaft was reinforced with iron. A round or oval shield was the only protective armament. Only wealthy warriors possessed helmets and chainmail. When going on a campaign, each warrior was required to arrive at the assembly point with a supply of provisions for 3 months and clothing for 6 months, which was determined by the typical duration of service, from spring to autumn. However, from the 6th century onward, infantry rapidly lost its importance on the battlefield. At that time, the stirrup, an invention from China, made its way into Europe, and cavalry became the main type of military force for a long time. Why? Before the stirrup, cavalry could not attack at full gallop, because in such a case, upon striking with a lance, the rider would be immediately thrown from the saddle by the force of inertia. The tactics of cavalry consisted in riding up to the enemy formation and standing in place, stabbing at enemy warriors with a lance, hoping to break the formation. At best, cavalry would flank the enemy and attack from the rear, also standing still, or moving at a light trot. Now, however, cavalry attacked in a wave at full gallop, and the energy of the galloping horse was added to the impact of the strike, multiplying its force many times over. Cavalry now swept away everything in its path, even well-organized infantry. As a result, cavalry dominated the battlefield throughout the Middle Ages until the emergence in the early modern period of well-trained infantry armed with long pikes and halberds. However, heavy cavalry could not possibly be formed on the basis of a universal militia. In the Frankish army, warriors themselves had to acquire their weapons and equipment, which were quite expensive. According to the Ripuarian law, a helmet cost 6 solidi, armor 12, a sword with scabbard 7, greaves 6, spear and shield 2, and a warhorse 12, for a total of 45 solidi. To realistically assess whether this was a large or small amount, I will cite another article from the same Ripuarian law. If someone is to pay a vergeld, let him give a horned, sighted, and healthy bull for 2 solidi, a horned, sighted, and healthy cow for 2 solidi. In other words, one had to pay an entire herd of cattle for weapons and equipment. Only a large landowner could afford such means. Moreover, with the transition to a cavalry-based army, time was of the essence. The adherents of a new religion, Islam, which emerged in the early 7th century, were filled with determination to bring the light of truth to the nations through holy war, jihad. Within just a few decades, the warriors of Islam had conquered half the world. These conquests did not bypass Europe. In 711, the warriors of the Umayyad Caliphate invaded Spain, and after defeating the Visigoths, began the conquest of southern Gaul, Septimania, and Aquitaine. Only heavy cavalry could stand against the Muslim horsemen. In this context, the mayor of the palace, Charles Martel, carried out the so-called Benefice reform. Benefices were created, landholdings granted for life, on the condition of military service. Please note, it was not just a land plot, but a land holding, that is, a village or half a village whose inhabitants, from the moment the benefice was granted, began to pay all their taxes not to the state, but to the beneficiary. Later, the benefice was transformed into a fief or feudum, a land holding granted for hereditary use on the condition of military service. From this income, the beneficiary could equip himself for service in the army and support himself and his family. The holders of benefices, later fiefs, received the title of knights in France, chevaliers. Every knight who received a benefice was required to appear in the royal army on a trained horse with weapons and protective gear, which had to include armor, a lance, and a sword. Charles Martel's efforts were successful, and in 732 the Frankish cavalry army of knights defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Poitiers. An idea of the outward appearance of a Frankish warrior can be gathered from a description left by a monk of the Abbey of St. Gall in the year 773. The king wore an iron helmet with a crest and iron chainmail bracers. His thighs were covered with chainmail, and his legs with iron greaves. In his left hand he held an iron lance, and in his right a sword. The king's shield was made entirely of iron, without any patterns or emblems. The king's warriors were equipped more lightly, so that they could more easily leap on to their horses' backs. Now briefly about the elements of the Frankish knight's armament. Chainmail had the shape of a tunic, with a hem reaching to the middle of the thighs and short sleeves down to the elbows. The chainmail consisted of 20,000 to 25,000 rings, with a diameter of 6 to 10 millimeters. Many knights replaced chainmail with plate armor. The Franks wore simple iron helmets of segmented construction. The helmet dome was made of 2 or 4 parts, joined together with rivets. A nasal guard for facial protection, or a chainmail aventail for neck protection, could be attached to the helmet. The knight's primary weapon was the lance. The shaft of the lance reached a length of 2 or more meters, and its thickness was 2.5 to 3.5 centimeters. Ash, willow, or poplar were used to make the shaft. The massive iron spearhead belonged to the sock type, and was designed not only for thrusting, but also for slashing strikes. Shields had a round, slightly convex shape and a diameter of about 80 to 90 centimeters. They were made from planks of alder, poplar, or oak. To make them convex, the wooden blanks were steamed and bent, then joined edge to edge in much the same way barrels are made today. The shield was held with a fist grip, via a central handle running across the entire field of the shield, which gave it additional rigidity. On the outer side, the handle was covered by an iron umbo. The outside and edges of the shield were glued with linen, then covered with finely dressed sheepskin, and brightly painted. Swords of the Carolingian era had long and wide double-edged blades that narrowed slightly toward the point with straight cutting edges. The average blade length was 70 to 80 centimeters. A wide fuller ran down the middle of the blade, along its entire length, to reduce weight. To protect the expensive blade from moisture, swords were carried in scabbards made of wood and covered with leather or fabric. The lower part of the scabbard was adorned with a chape, which was cast from bronze and richly decorated with openwork engraving and embossing. On this note, I conclude my story. Goodbye.